IVM.
India's economic growth has fallen below 5% per annum. For a growing economy like ours, this might as well be a recession. How can we get India's economy back on track? Anupam Manur returns to the Pragati Podcast to share his thoughts. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Anupam Manur is an assistant professor of economics at the Takshashila Institution and a friend of the show. We'll start our discussion with Anupam after a short break.
Hey everybody, an awesome week on IVM Podcast is coming up for you. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're everywhere. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as IVM Podcast. We're also on LinkedIn, and I'm going to be putting a lot more stuff on that platform too. We'd also like to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life and Storytel, for their continued support. And remember, if you think you or your brand can benefit by working with us or, sponsoring shows for us, we'd really appreciate that. So just a last call to everybody. Please do fill out our listener survey if you want your voice to count on the future of IVM. It would be great to get your input right now. We're going to keep the listener survey up till the 7th of February 2020. Please do fill it in. We'd really do appreciate your help. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to content creators Pulkit Kochar and Viraj Gilani at Pocket Aces about how they create content and how to have your hands in multiple pots. On Geek Fruit, Jishnu talks about the new Doolittle movie. Dinkar and Tejas give their take on 1917. And all three of them try and figure out what's happening with CW's Crisis Crossover. On Golgappa, Trupti is joined by Pranit Chilimkar, who talks to her about fitness and health. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talks about the importance of doing the research before deciding and settling on something, be it health-related or not. On What a Player, Mikhail and Dudeja talk about the India vs New Zealand T20 matches and Virat Kohli dropping a catch during the second game. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Avinash Luthria, a SEBI-registered investment advisor, to talk about 5 common misconceptions around investing. On Pulya Bazi, hosts Saurabh and Pranay discuss the randomized control trials that led to the Economics Nobel Prize. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav shares experiences from his 17-hour train journey to Uzbekistan. On GBCD, Sunetra and Farah talk about their preferences for their sexual partners and discuss if that can lead to bias and prejudice. On Thanle Harate, the Kannada podcast, Gautam Shenoy joins Ganesh Chakravarti to talk about science fiction and its influence on society. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to the Pragati Podcast. Anupam, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Anupam, we are going to talk about the budget today. You're going to run away out of the studio if I say that, right? In fact, we don't want to talk about the budget today. I think the budget is its own spectacle. I have also made a part of a living out of writing about budgets. And I know how farcical a lot of things around it can be. And especially in a time where we are seeing a lot of things happening off the budget, a lot of the budget marksmanship, as you will, is becoming very flawed. The more important thing right now is while there's a massive jobs crisis in the country, we are also now going back to very bad growth, right? So there was a period where people were saying, oh, look at these growth numbers. They seem to be very high, but, our real economy seems to be struggling more. I don't know what's happening there. But now even the official GDP estimates, the growth numbers have dropped to less than 5%. And even that growth is being led by things like government spending. So in this time, I think it's very important to see 2020 onwards, if we really have a shot at reaching this 5 trillion economy in just a few years as opposed to a whole decade, we really need to know how to get back to high growth. So, Anupam, can you first lay out where we are when it comes to our economic growth?
You're absolutely right. For a long period, I think we were speaking about jobless growth. So the GDP growth rate was still about 7.5, 8, 9% in the 2000s, which is astounding figures. And then, but there was no corresponding kind of growth in employment and so on. Then we had a first big kind of slippage in GDP growth in 2012-13, which probably we'll come back to because there's a lot of lessons from that particular period. And 2014, we again hit back 8% growth, and we thought again, we're back on this high growth, track or trajectory. But what has happened since then is kind of disappointing. Since those heady days in, early 2014 and so on, when we hit about 8% growth, I think after that 1 year or so, we did well on the GDP front, general economic front. But since then, it's been slippages. So, there's consecutive quarters where our GDP growth rate has been coming down. So if you look at the line chart, it seems like a swing. That, I think, is the uncomfortable territory that we find ourselves in, because this falling GDP numbers is, again, coupled with a whole set of other problems that has always existed. But again, we could take solace in the fact that, yes, our job numbers are not that good, but at least, GDP is going up. And again, remember that it's not just a random number that we're feeling happy about, but if the fact that GDP is going up means incomes are going up. And if incomes are going up, at least people, have money to spend and eat and so on, right?
And there's just more economic activity happening in the country.
Precisely. So, which is why, that GDP number is so important in its own sense. What has happened since then, of course, is that along with all of the other problems that has existed, now you're in the territory of slowing GDP and general economy. So the latest figures was that 4.5%, if I'm not mistaken, which is, quite a fall. In fact, there have been few economists in India who said that, we should consider a fall to 4.5% equivalent to a recession. Now, if the US economy goes from a normal GDP growth rate of 2% to about -1, -2%, that is seen as a recession. But if you look at it, it's just a 4 percentage point dip. We are facing a 4 percentage point dip from 8.5% to 4.5%, right? It's not in negative territory. India is, it's a growing economy. It's too big. It's, we're just low base and all of that. So I don't think Indian economy will ever go into the negative territory in the next 10 years or so. But I think the slowdown or this, the magnitude of the fall is big enough to actually look at it as you can give it whatever names. It's more than just a ordinary kind of slowdown.
Thank you for bringing this up, because this was going to be one of my follow-up questions, because a lot of the times we talk about potential GDP growth and what actual GDP growth is, and potential GDP growth is a fictional number. It's a calculated estimate by economists. But there is this part which is at the bottom, right, where for a growing economy, for a developing economy, which is still adopting technology and policies from other parts of the world, at what point do you say that a growth number below this is harmful to this country, right? One is to say that, look, if you grow slower, then you will grow out of poverty slower and everything will become slower. But it's important to know the gears that make an economy work, the gears that underpin various assumptions that we have about our life. I think in India, if you're thinking that your life next year will be better than life this year, and if that has to be true for a majority of Indians, I think we need 5 to 6% growth minimum, right?
Minimum.
And below that, it means that all sorts of things start going wrong, and it's not just inflation.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things to be highlighted here. One is that if we look at just India's population numbers and labor force growth rate, that itself is about 2.5%, right?
Right.
But just by doing nothing, just by basically reproducing and populating the country, you're adding about 2% of GDP growth, because every year you got 9 or 10 million people who enter the workforce. They do a little bit of work, whatever it is, menial jobs, really not high-end, high productive work, just basic level of work. As it is, you're adding about 2.5%.
Right.
So the additional growth that you're talking about is from all the other raw materials and inputs that we are anyway using. So where is that exponential part, right? If all of your growth is just explained by growth in labor and raw materials, then that means that your economy is not really doing well, because ideally, you for a country such as India and the particular stage of growth that it is in, if your raw materials and labor growth is giving you about 4%, the combination of that and you put technology into the mix, it's supposed to grow at 4 into 2 or 3 times. That 2 or 3 times is what technology and the advancement and increase in productivity is supposed to give you, which means we should have been looking at a 10 to 12% growth rate as a given almost. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. Second, I think we get caught up in all forms of comparisons with China on various levels. And yes, China did a few things, but I still think it's one of the most impressive feats ever recorded by any country in the world, where, China basically grew for about 10% growth, double-digit growth for continuous, about 30 years or so.
Right.
And look at where China is now in terms of just, getting people out of poverty and so on. Yes, it is riddled with its own set of problems, but if you just look at economic growth and how it managed to bring large numbers of people out of poverty and into being one of the richest kind of countries in the world, at least certain parts of China are. India has a very, very, very long way to go to even come near that, because we, again in the 2000s, we actually thought that 9% was the new normal. I think it was this massive complacency on our part, thinking that without really having done anything, I mean, we did one set of reforms in 91. We then just sat on our backsides, did not really do any other reforms. We built a few highways in 2000s, right?
That was a big thing.
And a bit of telecom. But we've not really done anything else. And we thought that, we can achieve 9% growth. But, now in retrospect, we know that a large part of that 9% growth was just because the global kind of financial markets were flushed with liquidity, and India was just a good bet for a lot of these people. So, we kind of grew because of that. And that 9% now seems like a distant dream, right? It seems like such a distant dream because we are in, again, very middling territory. Having 1 or 2 quarters of, 8% growth is not enough. You need consistent 10% GDP growth to, again, this is not to, get into some book records or flaunt to the world that we are growing at this rate, because it's more to do with, each GDP growth percentage point will actually help in bringing so many X people out of poverty. I think you have the figures for that you use.
Yeah, at least a couple of million people perhaps per every percentage point per year might be able to escape poverty.
Which means that, in previous year, instead of growing at, let's say, 8.5%, we've grown at 4.5%. That's 8 million people that we have not gotten out of poverty, right? So that's the real failing here. To remind all our listeners that this is not some nerdy, geeky economic stuff that we're talking about GDP growth, but it has very real consequences on the ground.
Right. So if this is the scenario, so the last time around in India when growth numbers dipped, so around 2012 or so. So even there, the economic problem started around 2009, 2010, right? Because we increased our fiscal deficit. So I think NREGA got universalized. I think the Sixth Pay Commission came into force. We did a massive loan waiver, which was about 1% of GDP or so. And all these together, for a while, they look good on the GDP balance sheet, right? Because if you're looking at GDP and there's that whole formula of your GDP is equal to what? Government spending,
consumption, all of that increase temporarily, yes.
Investment and then net of, imports and exports. So in this case, so we saw that growth increased for a while because of a stimulus given by the government, but then that petered away in 2 years and we dropped below 5% eventually.
I would actually correct you just here that it did not just peter away, but it massively dipped because of, it was not just a natural, that stimulus got over and the economy fell, but I would go on to say that, the kind of numbers that we saw in 2012, 2013, where it was again about 4.3%, which is the lowest that India has seen since the days of 80s. I would argue that was a direct result and consequence of that things that we did in 2009. This is what I normally refer to as macroeconomic karma. You cannot get away from it. You try and do a big push in 2009. Things will seem good in 2010. In fact, GDP growth again came back to 9%. And again, we thought we had escaped this the entire financial crisis without having felt any of the pinch. But then, these things come back to bite you. So 2012, 2013 is when we had, a whole set of macroeconomic failures. GDP growth falling to about 4.3% is just one among them. We had a rupee crisis, stock markets crashed. We had, literally a run on the rupee, by the way. If you remember, that was the first time when rupee touched about 60, 65 mark. And our, again, balance of payments was in a terrible condition. Our forex reserve started dwindling. So a whole set of problems.
So when we see this growth dropping, one of the things I see that happen on the government side is that all of your budgeting works on nominal GDP growth, right?
Yeah.
Because you're assuming that the economy in nominal terms will grow at, say, 10 or 12%, which means that your taxes should grow at a minimum of 12% and likely more if you've been doing some reforms. So one of the things that was happening in the lead up to 2010 and this sort of expectation that our growth will be very high was that at the same time we were seeing, I think, government tax revenues ballooning at 15, 20, even more than 20% year on year, because there were a lot of income tax related reforms. I think our TDS network came into place, other things put in place, service tax became more expanded thing. So there was this thing where within government there was this expectation of 15 to 20% increase in revenues year on year, based on which a lot of projections and calculations get made. And then finally the money doesn't arrive because your economy is not growing. And all your calculations get thrown into a tizzy, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that happened when the slowdown happened within the government. And even now that seems to be a different beast with the government, right?
Yeah.
A lot of GST expectations, the promise, the guarantee made by the centers to states that they'll be compensated for loss in GST growth by the center, if it's not enough. That all seems to be a reflection of what's happened a little less than a decade ago. What else is different this time?
See, again, I think in this, just the year gone past, which is FY 1920, you again had a nominal GDP growth projection of 12%. Right. And therefore tax revenue collections of something like, as you said, 15-16% at least. And then the reality was, however, different. I mean, nominal GDP growth last year was just 7.5 to 8%, I think. Right? Which is massively lower than what they had projected, which means that, all of your fiscal accounting just goes out of the books, right? Going ahead, they've made a nominal GDP growth projection of 10% for the coming year. And it's always good practice to wipe off a couple when you think about actuals, because whatever they project is obviously going to be higher. That immediately tells you that we are in dangerous territory. If you have nominal GDP growth at 8%, you're staring at some really bleak walls.
Real growth plus inflation, both are capping out at 8.
Yeah. So inflation right now, even if for the coming year it's about 5%, you're looking at real GDP growth of 3%. That is scary numbers.
But where's 5% inflation coming from? The other characteristic of things about 8 years ago was that we had stagflation, right? Yeah. Growth was dropping to below 5%, but inflation was hitting double digits. Yeah. But we are not in that situation today, right? Isn't our inflation well under control right now?
No, not at all. I mean, so we actually had a golden run when it came to inflation. 2014 to 2019 was the golden run when it comes to India's inflation story. CPI was well within the 5% mark. And again, people who took credit for that, saying it's because of structural reforms and so on, you could argue one way or the other. I would say it was more because of things like demonetization. I mean, how can you have inflation if you've basically killed off the economy? I mean, the entire informal economy and so on. But in any case, even if you ignore all of that, and there were actually some really promising stuff done in terms of inflation targeting and, monetary policy committee, let's assume that all of that was a success and inflation was well under 5%. In fact, it was scarily so that the wholesale price index, which, basically composes for, producers and the wholesale market, right? Unlike the consumer price index, which is meant for the retail market. The wholesale market, you saw that inflation was actually negative for quite some time.
Okay.
And that was very, very strange territory for India, right? That prices were actually, in the negative zone.
That
rate of change.
That sort of demand for goods in the economy was slipping a little? Is that
Again, I would say you have to, pin this with demonetization. If you've basically sucked off all the money and money supply, then how can people demand? And if you have a massive shortage of demand, then inflation will obviously come down.
So since you mentioned demonetization, I want to bring that up with one specific point with the GDP. From what I understand, whenever the GDP base year and so on is revised, so every 5 to 10 years, a detailed survey of the economy is done, right? So we've discussed the GDP in the past episode. The whole idea is how do you survey the economy more accurately? And if your economy's shape changes in 5 years, say you had no commerce and suddenly you have e-commerce, you need to sample this new economy in a better manner. And so you revise those systems. But in India, one of the things that is done in parallel with that is an estimation of the informal sector of the economy, right? What percentage of the Indian economy is the informal sector? And that sort of of used almost as a percentage add-on to other calculations,
Yes,
right?
yes.
In a rough way.
Yes, you basically, you calculate the real sector. I mean, the things that you can calculate where there are databases. And you say if this is about 1/5 of the actual economy, which means the rest of it is informal economy, you take, you extrapolate that into something.
And there have been numbers, I think, between 12 and 18% of India's GDP is informal and so on. So the idea was that in the calculation, you add that at the end. Post demonetization, I don't know what that number is.
Yeah, we don't know.
To me, that is one of the biggest problems with the GDP numbers today, because yes, the real economy is growing at this percent, but there is a baked-in assumption that the informal economy is keeping pace in some way.
Yeah.
And I don't know if just a full 8% of India's wealth or something just got eroded at that point.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is where, in fact, there's, a scope for much worse kind of news, which is that, there's a lot of even suspicion thrown at the GDP numbers that are coming out. So if you think that it's 4.5%, there are analysts who say that, not just analysts, but, starting from Arvind Subramaniam, who was the chief economic advisor himself, is saying that it's actually 2% more than what is being claimed. So if you looked at his math, and he'd done, complex regressions and so on, he's saying that real GDP growth is in fact in the territory of 3% and not even 4.5% and so on.
And my understanding is this, right? So if the Indian economy was size 100, and then 12 units out of that 100 was the informal economy, and that 12 got whittled down to 6, and so now you're working with 94, and 94 is growing a little, but then you're still below 100.
Yeah,
right?
you've
so
lost that 6.
So you need some time to catch up to 100 and some time to get beyond.
Yeah.
So, and now if you measure that growth from 100, you've not come as far.
Yeah.
Right?
And I mean, this was one aspect of it, which is the informal economy, but there's also a lot of doubt with regard to, what numbers are they using for extrapolating, because as we know, GDP, with the way it's calculated, is not 100% survey, right? They do a survey of, let's say, about a fifth of the economy, and then they extrapolate it and so on. So that extrapolation number that they use is itself suspect. For example, then there's the MCA 21 database, which has got, full of problems. There's about, there's, I think, about 20 to 30% of the database is just dead companies which don't exist anymore. And you're still calculating a growth percentage for these dead companies. So, it's riddled with problems.
So, Anupam, then at that point, if this data is so unreliable and we can't trust the GDP number as much as we used to, then why should we be worried if that number is coming down?
No, I just think that the same problem existed last year and the same problem exists this year. There's consistency in that, at least. So it still makes sense. So if you're saying that, real GDP growth was actually, 3% as against 4.5% that they stated, you have a number of deduction. I mean, number to deduct. So if suddenly they claim that, this year it's going to be 4%, then you again, wipe off a good 2% and you have an estimate of how good it's doing.
So then you're saying the likely problem with our GDP numbers is that there is a systematic error.
Yeah.
So there's a systemic error where we are overestimating what the number is.
Yes.
Okay, rather than a random error where we don't know what the real thing is and what we are estimating.
Yeah, it's not a random error. It's not even a deliberate political move. Hopefully not yet. I mean, I don't know, but it doesn't...
Weak evidence for that.
Yeah, there's no, this time we're going to increase the GDP number and, fudge around that data. I think our institutions, at least the statistical institutions, have not gone down to that level. So
Right. Okay. So coming back to where we are. So we've seen a slowdown in growth, sort of almost quarter after a little bit of an upswing. We've seen inflation that has risen up. For a while, we had a deflation problem, especially with the wholesale price index, but now even the cost price index has crossed 5%, right?
Consumer price index.
The consumer price index. So now we are having a higher inflation, although we are not in stagflation territory.
I think, we're just about heading there. I mean, we don't know how this will pan out, really. It's a bit early to say. I think there was an op-ed or a column by Manmohan Singh himself who said that, who had warned us of this fact that India is actually heading towards that stagflationary territory. And by the way, you should know because he
presided
over one of these infamous episodes. So a stagflation essentially is a situation where you have rising inflation and falling growth. Typically, you would expect a country to have, just if you have falling growth, you expect it to be coupled with falling inflation as well, or high growth and high inflation. I mean, these things tend to go together. But now you're in a territory where, I mean, it's probably the worst kind of situation for a country where you have high inflation and low growth. And I think we might be on the brink of that. It can still be mitigated, but depends on, again, what we do and so on.
Okay. So my final question before we take a break and then talk about how to fix some of these problems is, so if you're talking about growth, can you paint a picture over the last few years over what's happening with private consumption, with investment, and with imports and exports?
Okay, fantastic. I think, it's good to kind of just take a macro picture of all of this. And unfortunately, even, for our listeners, there's no good news here. I'm going to, put out that disclaimer right up front. Private consumption has been falling. What you call as a PFCE, which is private final consumption expenditure of the Indian economy, is actually slowing down. Not just slowing, but it massively fell, in fact, in the last 1 year. So even during demonetization, for example, private consumption didn't fall as much.
Okay.
It did fall, but it still, for example, averaged at about 6.8% growth. Right?
So private consumption here is what people as well as private companies consume in the year, right?
Yeah.
In terms of spending on labor, spending on land, spending on rent, spending on anything.
FMCG goods, buying stuff. Basically, think about the entire retail market. That's the easiest way to understand this. Think about it in the retail market space.
Right, but that's for us as individuals, but the same for companies.
Yeah, companies as well. They buy things, they buy raw materials, they buy a lot of the other things and so on. So,
so this is the lifeblood, essentially.
Yeah, and India's economy is largely consumption driven. We've been saying that, and it continues to be true. About, I think, 50% of GDP is just consumption or more, I would imagine. So for us, consumption growth is extremely important. And as I said, even the average is about 7.8 to 8% growth. And even during bad times, it still remains about 6%. So even during demonetization, for example, when you had the entire thing sucked out, you still had about 6%. It fell a little bit, but again quickly recovered and so on. I think that is one of the places which is truly worrisome now, that in the latest quarter, private final consumption expenditure fell to 3.1%.
That means people are not buying more, companies are not buying more.
Yeah. So this is, the stories that you heard, that people are not buying toothbrushes and toothpaste, right? And that, when FMCG falls, right, when the rate of growth of FMCG slows down, that for you is worrisome, because people are not spending on the most basic aspects, right? Sorry for this in advance, but the sale of innerwears have gone down massively in India, right? So that again should, ring some alarm bells. And in fact, that's just one aspect. But if you looked at the entire auto sector slowdown, for example, right, which we faced last year, with Bajaj going out and, criticizing the government policies and so on, the auto sector had a massive slowdown. Tractors, for example, people are not buying tractors, people are not buying scooters. Two-wheeler growth, for example, was a given in India, that people would go on buying two-wheelers. Right. But that actually slowed down, right? So
I'm a proud member of that community.
So, you had these things which, again, you look at all of these things, the amount of, for example, spending on trains came down. The amount of flights taken came down. The amount of, again, not really, the amount of flights taken didn't come down, but the rate of change came down, right? The growth rate.
So basically, you're saying people, if they could avoid spending on something, on average, they avoided spending on it.
Yeah.
Or avoided increases in spending on something.
Yeah, exactly. And that is actually a classic kind of economic indicator for a slowdown, because people expectations come into play, right? And if people expect a slowdown and therefore are not spending and saving up for that slowdown, then that slowdown will actually happen. This is like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And there's no way to escape that. This happened in Europe, this happened in the US. Every time when you have, the mass expectations change and people expect a slowdown, that is when a slowdown actually happens. So you could look at, various sectors, power generation and power consumption, and as I said, all forms of FMCG, auto, retail, all of these things, when it starts falling, that people are not spending. And the reason that people are not spending is either their incomes have gone down, which means we're not creating jobs and so on. That is one aspect that we already know. But the other aspect is that people's expectations of the future is kind of bleak, and therefore they're not spending. So these two things kind of go hand in hand.
So this is
that consumption aspect.
Consumption.
Move on to investment. Investment rate has been steadily falling, and that is again a worrisome trend. I've said this probably far too many times, but you go back just a decade back, and in 2010, for example, our investment rate was as high as 39% of GDP. Now it's 29% of GDP, a solid 10 percentage points fall in investment, and that has very real consequences for everything else, because once investment falls, that consumption will fall, jobs don't get created. If jobs don't created, you don't have incomes, or incomes fall. If incomes fall, consumption falls, and then overall economy kind of dips. And we've been seeing this kind of steady erosion in that investment rate, and there are multiple reasons for it. We'll try to get to it in the next part.
I just want a definitional clarification here. So when we are talking about investment in this context, what is this? Is this us putting money in our savings account? Does that become investment?
No, that is savings.
No. But then that is capital for the banks, which they
so
can
we
use.
can look at savings rate separately, but this is what you would call as gross capital formation, right?
Okay.
Gross fixed capital formation. So basically all forms of investment into assets. So from the government side, it would be, railways and highways and bridges and so on. But from the company side, it's buying more machinery. It's about, buying land, building factories and so on.
And the same at the household level as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So overall investment in the economy is coming down, as I said. But again, part of that reason is that savings rate has come down. Savings rate has come down. If you look at, overall savings rate is about 24% of GDP. Again, about a good 10 to 12 percentage points lower than what it was a decade back.
And this is largely household, right?
So that households are the only sector that actually ends up saving in India. I mean, government doesn't save. They don't even know what saving means. Corporates in India have not been saving. They're traditionally, more spenders than savers. External sector matters a lot, but we'll get to that. I mean, a big part of our savings actually comes from outside.
Right.
In terms of FDI and FII. But household sector savings have come down. And the problematic bit is that, large part of the household sector savings is still in unproductive kind of savings. If people save in gold, doesn't really matter for the economy. It's in fact dead investment or dead saving, right? But if you look at financial sector savings, it's come down from about 9% to about 6.5% now.
Okay, so that means financial sectors, mutual funds and banks?
Mutual funds and banks. Basically things that can be used to lend to others so that they can borrow and spend or invest, right? Okay. So that has come down. So that's on the investment and savings kind of bucket. Government expenditure is the only thing keeping the government GDP floating, by the way, which is terrible news for the economy if your only source of growth is coming from the government, because it is bound and constrained by a few things. And again, we'll get to FRBM later. And finally, you talk about exports. Again, if you look at September figures, September 2019, the export growth was the lowest it's been for the last 45 months or so.
Okay.
Again, bad news on that front, which is about 3.5 years low that we are seeing. And in fact, again, if you look at overall kind of a holistic last 10 years kind of picture, again, export growth is one of the lowest that it's been since 2012, 2013, where we had our big kind of crash. So,
has a saving grace, it feels wrong to even say it, but in the balance of payments between exports and imports, has a saving grace been that even imports are falling because our consumption is falling, and so therefore the balance remains not as terrible as it could be?
Yeah, it's actually, so it depends. It seems, and I didn't expect this from you, Pavan, but it seems like you're an optimist. But if you look at the data, first half of 2019, exports shrunk by about 2.4% in real dollar terms, and imports actually shrunk by 7%. So yes, you can be optimistic saying, our imports are falling faster than our exports, therefore our balance of payments is not as bad. But it actually indicates that the economy is doing terrible. If our imports are going down, and remember, we don't really import a lot of Mercedes-Benz and BMWs, but we import a lot of basic necessities again. So if that is shrinking, then again it tells you that overall economy is not doing well. And it would be worse if, and I have to look at the figures, to be honest, I've not looked at it, but if our oil demand is falling, which forms like the biggest chunk of our import bill, then that is a surefire indicator that the economy is slowing down. So that gives you, I've just tried to paint as broad a stroke as possible to tell
and
you.
as bleak a stroke as possible.
Bleak is part of it. You called me on the podcast, it's going to be bleak.
All right. Anupam, thank you so much. Let's take a quick break and come back, and maybe you can shine some rays of optimism in a few random directions. We would like to thank HDFC Life Insurance for supporting this show. HDFC Life has created an online video series called Behind the Journey with some of the most interesting people from the creative and entertainment industry. It explores the stories that are behind the glitz and the glamour of the spotlight and the screaming fans. Let's listen to a snippet from the episode featuring actor Jitendra Kumar.
इनिशियली जब मैं बहुत ऐसे कुछ चीज नहीं वर्क कर रही है एक्टिंग में, तो मैं बहुत पैनिक कर जाता था. तो काफी लोग मुझे सलाह देते थे कि नहीं, मतलब उतना पैनिक मत कर, मतलब धीरे धीरे ग्रो करेंगी चीजें. तो जिस तरह से तुम्हारा काम धीरे धीरे ग्रो करता है, एक दिन में नई चीजें मिलती हैं. आई थिंक तुम्हारा जो फाइनेंशियल साइड है उस पर भी तुम्हें ध्यान देना चाहिए, और वो भी धीरे धीरे डेवलप होता है. वो भी एक दिन में नहीं होता, और वो होने लगता है.
As Jeetu said, steady growth is a good sign for both your finances and the journey of your dreams. You can watch all episodes of Behind the Journey on the HDFC Life Insurance YouTube channel, youtube.com/HDFC Life. Take control of your personal goals with HDFC Life's financial solutions. Plan now with HDFC Life Insurance.
Terms and conditions apply. HDFC Life Insurance Company Limited, IRDAI, registration number 101.
Hi, and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm here with Anupam Manur, and we are having a very, very optimistic conversation on India's growth. If you're only tuning in now, then ignore what I just said. Anupam, you mentioned that in India, private consumption, that is consumption by companies and by individuals, is sort of the bedrock of growth in India. It forms the largest chunk. So if we now want to improve this, get this back above 5%, 6%, 7% in real terms, and hopefully in reliable terms, what do we need to do to get there? How do you as government or as a policy maker push this on?
Right. I think we can look at it in two broad angles. One is, again, short-term and kind of a medium to long-term solution. So the short-term, there are multiple ways in which you can boost consumption, spending, but ultimately all of it comes down to putting money in people's pockets, right? Only if they have that will they spend. But I think a larger picture in terms of real economic kind of solutions for this is that you only have to increase people's kind of optimism and expectations, and this podcast is not helping in that. But only when people feel good about the economy and about the future do they spend. So one of the things, for example, you have these well-known kind of age theories in economics called life cycle income hypothesis or Modigliani's, again, similar kind of Friedman's and Modigliani's hypothesis about that, even if you put money in people's pockets, you do a massive kind of fiscal push and you basically do like a farm loan waiver. That's what it comes down to, that money in people's pockets. They're not necessarily going to spend. Okay. Because if they assume that the future is bleak, then they will use that money to save for that bleak future. And this is, by the way, exactly what happened in Europe. When they had that slowdown, Europe didn't get out of that slowdown for a long period. Even now, by the way, they're just about, in the positive territory, but not really doing exceptionally well. Far from that. And so the 2009-10 crisis and what happened in Europe, basically, there was a fiscal push, there was a monetary push. You basically had interest rates, negative real interest rates. If you wanted to put money in the bank, you had to literally pay the bank to hold your money. Whereas, and it was designed in such a way that you should go out and spend that money. Similarly, in terms of fiscal, they did a lot of things to increase people's income. And this is very instructive for India. The reason I'm going into this is that it is quite instructive to India. People basically use that money and despite negative real interest rates, kept it in the bank. They said, we're not going to spend because I expect the future to be bleak, and therefore I'm not going to spend it. And you also know that if you get a big kind of, at least in Europe, mature economies, if you get a big fiscal push now, then the government has to recover it in the next period. So you kind of know that, and that trick is no longer valid.
And so this is essentially the European buffalo then, right? I mean, there have been studies on the Indian buffalo, and the buffalo is a savings instrument. And the buffalo is a savings instrument with a bad negative interest rate, right? I think -3, or there were different estimates. Yeah. So where basically people found that even with whatever yield and utility of that buffalo, it's a net negative interest asset, but it is still useful because you have people who are struggling with poverty, struggling with savings. Here's one way to actually have some saving which you can cash in on, and every other option has a worse interest rate, right?
Yeah.
And the option of just keeping cash in the house is not an option, and there'll always be pressure to spend as well. So this is the reality for a lot of Indians, right? So even though people might have money to spend, they would rather invest in something which stays as an asset for them, even if the return is negative.
Usually, yeah. That kind of explains, forget about, I don't think anything in India gives you negative returns, but that explains why people go and, buy so much of gold, because there's kind of uncertainty about the future, and there are no good alternatives. I mean, you go back to again 2012, 2013 when things were, kind of similarly bleak. There was a massive rush for gold, and that is, by the way, part of the problem that also precipitated the rupee crash, because we are basically importing so much of gold. But no one trusted banks. And with inflation at 14% and bank deposit rate at 9%, inherently people understand that that's not a good, this thing. That's equivalent to negative real interest rates.
Absolutely. And one clarification here on gold, and this is a personal thing. One, we can have this conversation in the podcast. You go and talk to people around you about gold, and everyone will tell you, oh, gold is always a good investment, sir. Always. You should put some money in gold. Like that is a very common thing in India.
Yeah.
So one, you're saying when people put money in gold, one, it's a useless asset because it doesn't get utilized. So it's
from the economic perspective, it's completely useless.
So it's money that's sort of dead there. But what is the return on gold? So if I had put my money in gold 10 years ago, would I be in a good position in India?
I don't really track gold prices, but if you look at, historical kind of examples of gold movements, I think over a 40 to 50 year period, gold gives you positive returns for sure. But the clincher is that stock markets actually give you 4x that return. The same money. And there's enough data in the US and studies in the US, for example, that if you put the same amount of money in a stock market, in a mutual fund, not even pick individual stocks, just the entire kind of like the Nifty 50, right? Just go and put all your money in Nifty 50 and don't touch it for the next 40 years. You will get a far, far, far better rate of return than gold can ever give you. But that's, so that's...
But the Nifty also gave better returns than most hedge funds, right? Over that kind of a long period. Yeah. All right.
So that's anyway, the thing. But if you want to get back to this whole consumption aspect and how do you increase it, I would say don't worry too much about it. India's, again, all said and done, it's slowing down, but it is a growing economy. People will spend. Ultimately people will buy stuff. I don't think we really have to be worried about consumption. In fact, I would argue that if you do anything to artificially boost consumption at this point, it can do more damage to the economy, because, that is when you would divert funds from whatever investment is taking place to this artificially boosting consumption. So when, a lot of people, in fact, were really disappointed with this budget, that there was no real big push for rural incomes and therefore rural consumption and spending. I, in fact, was quite happy with that. In fact, it showed a level of maturity and restraint by the government, because it's extremely tempting. It's extremely tempting to say, I will basically, equivalent whatever, through whatever policy instrument, it doesn't matter, but equivalent of saying that I will give 500 or 1,000 rupees to each basic rural person, right, or household or family. It's very tempting to do that, and there are enough kind of policy instruments to also give that. You could do a subsidy, you could do something else. But I think it showed a level of restraint by the whether intentionally or unintentionally, I don't care, but they didn't do that. Because if you'd done that, as I said, it would divert real available funds from investment and so on to this artificially boosting consumption. And again, we don't even know if people will use it, because again, if their expectations of the future is bleak, then they will not necessarily use that, extra income.
Right. And to pull a figure from Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar's new book, the marginal cost of public expenditure is about 4:1, right? So for the government to spend 1 rupee in some meaningful way, the cost to society is 4 rupees.
Yeah.
So unless you're doing that spend on things which give you notionally a 4x or a 5x return, you're doing that very poorly.
Yeah.
And handing that as a 1 rupee subsidy sometimes is the worst way to do it.
It is the worst.
But having said that, so then my takeaway is consumption is something that can be left as an outcome metric.
Exactly.
And you don't go poke and meddle directly.
Consumption is nothing but a reflection of other things. If the other parts of the economy is doing well, consumption will do well. I mean, if you think about it, right, ultimately consumption is the difference between income and saving, right? And so then one way is to say that, you're going to increase that income. And how do you increase income? By employment. How do you increase employment? Investment. So in fact, this kind of takes you to the next logical step that we want to speak about, which is investment, right? How do you increase investment in the economy? So I would say that
but I want to pause before we get into how do we increase investment, because it's fine to have this overall conversation about consumption, but we have to acknowledge rural distress, right? And again, the solution I'm advocating is not just give money, give a subsidy, give yet another basic farmer income or anything. But what is the real short-term solution to widespread rural distress that we've been seeing over the last 5-6 years? If it's not a loan waiver, if it's not a cash transfer, I can't think of any structural reforms in the agricultural sector which will actually pay a dividend in the next 3-4 years. Right? Everything takes much longer, maybe takes a decade or more. Then can you do anything at all?
In the short term, I think the answer is probably no. I mean, the answer is patience, and that is one of the reasons.
And that's easier for us to sit here and say, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, and this has serious political and other consequences too.
Yeah, because electoral consequences.
Not just electoral, right?
That's one aspect of it, which matters obviously to the people who are.
I agree, but even beyond electoral, I mean, if you have. It has societal implications, right? I mean, it's one thing about the glorification of the farmer and almost deification while not doing much. But the other part is if you have hundreds of millions of Indians who are struggling to eke out all kinds of different strains of non-farm income, that's not adding up to much, farm sector is still struggling, then that has a lot of cascading effects, right? Because one thing we've seen is that agricultural prosperity is actually linked to people exiting agriculture as well.
Exactly. Where I would say that the solution lies. So we're talking about, again, I would say let's talk about investment. The reason being that even in investment, there are, as with consumption, as I said, there are short-term and long-term aspects to it. Now, the long-term aspect is about, fixing the entire goddamn economy. All right, we'll get to that later. But in the short term, either you allow for complete private investment into the rural economy, right? And part of that could be just allowing for massive agro-based, food processing units and so on, which means probably, completely freeing up FDI in retail. You want Walmart to set up this entire kind of supply chains where they, they buy food from agriculture, whatever produce from agriculture, process it in the rural area, and then ultimately sells it on this thing, right? So that FDI in single brand retail, you want to free it up so that you have investment in rural sectors. That's just one solution. I'm just talking about a particular solution for this. How do you get the rural aspect of it? Right. And then what that automatically does is also it creates jobs, right? It creates massive amount of employment for this thing. So that all of that hidden unemployment that you would have in agriculture, right? That 4 out of 5 members who are not really required on the field but who are still there now can get jobs, hopefully, in these big agro-processing units. And then, therefore, their incomes will increase, and with their incomes increasing, then consumption will automatically flow. That's one aspect of it. Now, even if you think that that's going to take time or that's not going to be immediate, I mean, it requires a bit of this thing, that's where government spending should come in. The government spending or investment, right? Government investment should be in the form of rural works. Now, I'm not talking about NREG, I'm not talking about small PWD works. I'm talking about big infrastructure projects. Now, if ever there was a time and justification for government expenditure, it should be now and in this manner. That you build, although your NHAI plans of building massive highways and so on, now is the time. And this will necessarily go through, rural areas, and this will necessarily then create jobs for people. And, by creating jobs, you obviously raise incomes and so on. The other aspect is you got to free up the land. All of this will be possible if you free up the land, agricultural land. So just the ability for farmers to sell their land. By the way, that creates income again, short-term income, sure, but it creates that income. But then that land can be used for productive purposes by someone else for these long-term investments that I'm talking about, which will create whatever jobs and so on. So that's the short-term.
So that's
kind of
a nice segue into the whole investment part. So if these are some of the things sort of targeting rural India, overall, what else can be done to improve investment climate in the country?
So there's, again, investment climate. So there's a whole set of aspects of investment climate itself, which is, political stability, economic stability. I mean, we know these things, right? In terms of economic stability, for example, our inflation until now, as I said, now we got an increase, but I would still be hopeful on that front that it is quite a temporary kind of increase, your 7.5% and so on. Largely, if you look at, the numbers, I was kind of being alarmist in the beginning, just to get people's attention. But, if you look at the numbers and break down that 7.35% CPI, you would see that a large part of it is because of vegetable and fruit prices. So if you look at something called core inflation, that is still under control, and RBI, because you've done these institutional changes, I think inflation is something that we don't have to really worry about in the short term. Therefore, that kind of gives you a lot of economic stability for people to spend and, invest. Your biggest problem in this whole investment bit is access to funds and access to finance, right? Okay. You have a never-ending saga of your NPA crisis and banks going down and cooperative banks going down and then NBFCs going down and creating, panic in the market, your ILFS and so on. So I think that is where the real problem lies with investment. Until you solve that aspect, there's no way you can, get investment back on track.
So the investment crisis is the banking crisis.
Investment crisis and banking crisis go real hand in hand.
So one thing that was done is all the mergers of the various banks such that
that's a cop-out. That's a cop-out solution. That's a cowardly solution. It is a solution.
But it can also be taken as the first step of a longer solution, right? But have we seen...
If you leave that... I've not seen any indicators that they want to ever completely privatize some of these banks. Now, you merge it and, I think there was you could have merged 2 or 3 banks and then privatize the rest. And then, I'm not saying give up State Bank, okay? Yes, that's your jewel and you need it for all your government purposes. Keep that. You keep 1 or 2 other good ones as well. But it's high time we privatize some of these banks. That's, I think, the only other way out, because you can keep recapitalizing them, right? Which we do. Even this time, by the way, we've spent some money in the budget for recapitalization of banks. But the problem is that unless you change that governing structure that exists, where, basically your MD is chosen by the finance minister and therefore the loans are given based on calls made by political masters and so on, the NPA crisis will never go away.
But then we see the same with ICICI too, right? So, I completely agree with you that we need to privatize a lot of these banks, but it's privatization plus reform of banking.
Overall reform of banking sector, yes. But if you just look at the numbers, I'm not saying ICICI is now the golden boy or of banking anywhere in the world, but if you just look at the ratio of NPAs, where it's coming from, of the total, I think 18% of gross NPA that exists in the economy, largely I would imagine that 12 to 13% is public sector, whereas just about 5% is private sector. And that 5% is pretty much normal across the world, and you must allow them to fail as well. In fact, I would say that is where, you have a depositor insurance scheme, which is good. But apart from that, you should allow the banks to fail. We've never gotten to that situation, luckily. And I don't think we will. Our private sector banks are not bad, really. You do need reforms, but they're not that not the Citibank of the world.
And we do have many new private banks which are actually doing phenomenally well. I think HDFC recently posted sort of great
good numbers,
growth and numbers. So we do have private banks which are doing very well, which don't have NPAs on their balance sheets, and they're quite healthy, right?
And so if you want to solve the NPA crisis in kind of a medium to long term, it is to privatize these banks. Get rid of a lot of these public sector banks and then do real corporate reform for the private sector banks. So for example, you got the entire board of any public sector bank should be done as in any other corporate. There should be no political influence. That's a very small, seems like a small change, but has massive implications for how the banks are run and therefore what kind of loans are given.
Businesses and the economy of India runs.
Exactly.
Right? If you are removing all political influence from who gets a loan.
Yeah.
Right? That's massive.
Yeah. And then you got to remove a lot of other restrictions on these banks as well. We again, like similar to how we flog the tax policy in order to achieve, 15 different objectives, I think we use our public sector banks to achieve 15 different objectives, apart from the actual banking that they're supposed to do. And in fact, that explains a lot of, why our public sector banks do so poorly, because we expect them to give priority sector lending. Basically, give loans to farmers and then we write that off, right? And then we ask them to give loans to small and medium enterprises. We ask them to give loans to cottage industries at extremely low rates. All of these are write-offs, by the way. You'll never see them back again.
While that is happening in parallel, if you are a small or medium-sized enterprise, it's very hard for you to access
if you're a genuine small or medium enterprise, you can't get funding, right? Especially if you're in the city and so on.
So these are for quote-unquote SMEs.
SME, yeah.
Okay.
So it's a really twisted, distorted market. And the financial sector mess that we find ourselves in, I think, has a lot to do with the investment crisis. And therefore, when we have the investment crisis, we're not creating jobs, right? If you have, for example, just one kind of statistic that more than 40% of our projects are in fact stalled. It started but never finished, right? And that is a alarmingly high number, and a big reason for that, two big reasons. One of it is they run out of funding.
Right.
The banks give them initial funding and then they say, sorry, we don't have money and we don't trust your project, so they don't give funding. The next is lack of clearances. Right? They get to a part and then suddenly the environmental, you don't get a clearance for that, or you don't get clearance by someone, other government body. Right? So the number of stalled projects in India is just alarmingly high. And that's part of the investment problem again.
So, and this is something that started getting solved, right? When we had the last crisis, I think there was a whole team set up within the government of India to sort of fast track certain projects, and and there was some progress made, but we are still sort of stuck there.
Yeah,
the size of the solution is much smaller than the size of the problem.
Disproportionately smaller than the size of the problem. So
okay.
That's, I don't know where else to go. There's so much more to talk about investment But
in this, one thing I need to point out is, on the FDI front, we're doing well. Right, by and large.
We are getting funds.
What little investments happening, a lot of it might have been driven by FDI, right?
Yeah, so we do get funds from FDI and FIs, but again, it's not as simple as that, because the minute you have, let's say, the US economy doing really well, which is what is happening now, the US economy itself is heading towards a recession and so on, that's the predictor. But as of now, at least the US economy is doing well, which means interest rates are going up in the US. The minute interest rates go up in the US, all your funds will rush back to the US, right? Because it's the safest kind of investment. So, I don't think we can consistently rely on FDI as our source of funding. It is an important source. In India, it has been the kind of poster boy for some of these things. But now if you look at the political climate, and I don't want to get into that, and the economic climate, I think some FDIs will be, the investors would take a second thought about, should I be investing in India? And you look at the kind of coverage that India has been getting, right? The India story is becoming bleak. Look at what you might call them, the most biased and this thing that they have something against India. I don't care. But The Economist, New York Times, Washington Post, all of them are talking about India in a negative fashion, and, both on the economic front and the political front. It's not just political.
And we've seen India hysteria on the economic front before, right? So when people are bullish about India, they're extremely bullish, like over optimistic that
2014.
No, and even before that,
even
right?
Before that,
when you talk about foreign investments and foreign investors talking about India and the kind of growth they'll see in 5 years, they'll be targeting, 300 million people in the country. There's no foreign company which is really targeting 300, 400 million Indians. It's largely tier one.
Yeah.
But so you have this euphoria cycle and the extreme negative cycle.
And if you get into that negative cycle, I think it's very difficult. Again, I mean, it'll take quite some time before we get out. But before that, you can have extremely, quite big kind of consequences for the Indian economy, because we've been relying on this FDI and FII for our investment and for, that savings that we don't have. And if that kind of stops, then we are, I think, truly in a bad position. And we're not helping ourselves, again, by a lot of the rule changes that we make, in terms of we suddenly screw over pharma companies who have invested in India, for example. We put a price cap on something. Then we say, sorry, Amazon, you can't really do this. Out of the blue kind of rule changes, basically stopping FDI, both Amazon and Walmart from holding inventory. We've made a series of, I think, extremely negative protectionist moves, which would really shake up any kind of foreign investor and, make them think really hard about why should I be investing in India. I mean, if I was a foreign investor, I don't think I would have, given the climate, I wouldn't have come anywhere close to India. I would have gone to probably Vietnam. And that also, by the way, explains a lot of the companies that are moving out of China, for example. I mean, India should have been the perfect place that these investors should have come to, and build factories in India. But the fact that they chose Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia over India tells you that we are just not there. And this is purely of our own doing, right? There's no way you can blame anything else in the world for this. It is us, as that we've squarely done this to ourselves.
Okay. Again, wonderfully optimistic note, Anupam. A final note on, in all of this, the other thing that's also been new over the last 5 years is the growth of tariffs, right? So while we're putting taxes on other things, there's GST reform, and that's a separate discussion. Imports are more expensive now, right?
Yeah. So this is, again, as I said, part of the shooting ourselves in the foot aspect, right? Because, putting tariffs, there's one aspect to it, which is it reduces trade, reduces choice of consumers and so on. That's only one aspect of it. But the larger aspect is what signal you're sending to the world, right? This was, according to me, the trade war was a golden opportunity for India to say, listen, you guys fight it out, right? You put tariffs on each other, but I am going to remain, or not remain, I'm going to become a liberal country. So, import to us all you want. And that, in fact, imports lead to export. We know this. And I would say we have to become a far more liberalized economy. The only way, by the way, to increase exports from India is to liberalize imports, right? And so
because
if you've
most
done
goods are a part of a global supply chain,
Exactly.
right? So things go in and out.
Yeah.
So right now in India, most of the things where we add software in the global supply chain, if at all, right?
Yeah. But there's a lot of opportunity for, in fact, if you look at the biggest kind of contributor to Forex in India, you have software and you have remittances and so on, but one of the biggest things is gems and jewelry. And there, all we do is this value add. Right? We import diamonds from somewhere. We polish them in Surat, polish them in whatever, cut them and so on, and then export it. We're just part of the global value chain. But if you look at, but that is an old industry, right? But if you look at, how India is placed in terms of global value chains of the new industry of the, modern day technologies, we are terrible. 0.19% is our contribution to the global value chain in mobile phones. 0.04 is the contribution to LCDs. And LCD is not advanced, it's not semiconductors. It's LCD monitors, right? And we are contributing just 0.04%. And I can give you, a whole list of such things. Nothing is more than even 1%. That should really be something alarming, right? And saying, why are we not part of this global value chain? Why are we not really integrated into the world economy? I think India's trade forms just about 20% of India's economy, whereas it's about 38 to 40% of China. right? So I mean, I can go on, reeling of these statistics, but all of them point towards one thing, which is that we're not doing good on the exports and imports front. And again, if you look at the latest budget, a small thing, but we said that in terms of medical implant and medical instruments, right? The FM claimed that we are doing wonderfully well on this front. Make in India is working and we are in fact exporting to the world. And the next statement was followed by that, and therefore we should put an import duty on any medical implants that we import. That doesn't make sense. It just doesn't square up. If we are exporting it, then why do we need protectionism? Right? So one of the two has got to be true. So if you need protectionism, then it just means that we are not doing well, right? So just a very simple thing, but it tells you about the mentality and the approach that we are taking. And that for me is just, it's going to be more of the same. Our exports will never take off if we keep doing this.
Anupam, thank you so much. So if some of my takeaways from the second half of our conversation is, one, you look at private consumption as an outcome and don't try to interfere it with input measures and output measures. Two, look at, while structural reform and other things are always there at the background, banking reform is probably the single point biggest reform that can sort of revive growth. And third, don't go down worse protectionism.
Yeah.
Right? Liberalize as much, be it agricultural sector. One good thing, and I know it's easier for the government of India to do this, but there have been a bunch of model acts related to agriculture which have again been put out. I think, like we question the government of India on how good our economy is, I think we just need to start asking the same questions of our state governments a lot more. Because you look at the political climate for investment, it's been affected by states with flipping governments who are just cancelling old contracts.
Absolutely.
And that's very, very bad faith sort of conduct. I think, if India needs to grow at 7%, I think Karnataka needs to grow at 10%. And I want to be able to ask my chief minister how we are able to grow at 10%.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. I do not think that we hold our states accountable enough for a lot of these things. I mean, sometimes the policy making at the state level is just buffoonery. As you said, because you have some political rivalry, you just go ahead and cancel contracts that you've given to private players. That is just wrong on multiple levels. But yes, we should hold them accountable. And in fact, in this budget, a lot of the agricultural policies was just that, saying, listen, there is a model act, we urge the states to do it. And I was extremely happy that the government did not try to meddle, union government did not try to meddle with state subjects, right? Yes, we should hold our states more accountable on all of these fronts.
Anupam, thank you so much for coming back on the Pragati Podcast. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pavan. I just had a lot of fun. Even though it was a bleak topic, it's good fun to be here.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.